بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى
In the name of God, the most gracious, the most beneficent, peace be upon you. Good evening.
And a warm welcome to our exciting session with its key theme being transgenerational entrepreneurship. I'm your moderator Fuad Chapra, and it is my great pleasure to moderate today's webinar. A brief background about me: I had private enterprise and family business practice at KPMG Saudi Arabia. On behalf of KPMG Saudi, we would like to thank the National Center for Family Business for planning this insightful conference on the strategic theme of family business sustainability. The webinars which have been taking place over the last 2 days have been highly enlightening, and we hope that you will find this session equally insightful, inshallah. I'll quickly run you through the agenda slide. As you can see, we have divided today's webinar into 5 key parts. We will start with a brief introduction of our distinguished speakers, followed by a presentation on transgenerational entrepreneurship, which will be delivered by our distinguished speaker, Dr. Peter Jaskiewicz. We'll then request one of our prominent Saudi family business leaders, Mr. محمد بترجي, to share his insights into the Saudi experience with transgenerational entrepreneurship. We'll then have a panel discussion with both of our guest speakers. And at the end, we will have some time for questions from the audience. At this stage, let me introduce our distinguished speakers for today. We are delighted to have with us Professor Dr. Peter Jaskiewicz, who is joining us from Ottawa. Professor Peter is a full-time professor and university research chair at the prestigious Teilfert School of Management, University of Ottawa, Canada. His current research focuses on transgenerational entrepreneurship and corporate reputation in family and founder firms. Professor Peter's research has been ranked amongst the top 10 most relevant studies on family businesses globally in the years 2013, 15, and 17. Professor Peter is currently a review board member at the prestigious Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice Journal, and also the Family Business Review Journal. In addition to these academic positions, Professor Peter is an advisory board member at Venture for Canada, which is a program that gives Canadian students and fresh grads entrepreneurship training and real-world experience at innovative startups and small businesses. And I've come to know that Professor Peter is a passionate traveler and amazingly speaks 5 languages. Welcome, Dr. Peter. I'm pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you for it.
Please allow me also to introduce Mr. Muhammad Btterji. Mr. Btterji is a well-known Saudi family business leader from the 4th generation of Btterji family. He is the managing director for the leading pharma company, Btterji Pharma, and a board member for Btterji Holding Company. Muhammad is a holder of master's degree in international management from UK and currently a doctoral candidate in the domain of family business from IE Business School, Spain, and hopefully graduating soon with his doctoral degree. He is also the president of the IE Saudi Alumni Club, as well as a member in the executive committee of the Saudi-Swedish Business Council and the Saudi-Spanish Business Council. Muhammad also has research interest and is currently participating in research projects related to quite an interesting topic, which is socio-emotional wealth. Muhammad also enjoys traveling, gastronomy, and reading. Welcome, Ustaz Muhammad, for this webinar.
Thank you for having me.
Moving to our topic of this webinar, let me share a brief context that succession has always been a strategic consideration for family businesses and a very important topic for researchers alike. However, in our region, the discussion on succession most of the time implies leadership and ownership succession. Today, we explore this topic from a very different lens by asking the question, how can family businesses not only pass on a sustainable business to their next generation, but also how do they transfer the DNA of entrepreneurship to the next generation? Professor Jaskiewicz will talk about how some family firms remain entrepreneurial for generations, while others are unfortunately not able to. Without further ado, I'll turn now to Professor Jaskiewicz so he can take us through his presentation. Over to you, Professor Peter.
Thank you very much for the for the nice welcome, Fuad Chopra. Thank you also for the invitation to speak here. I'm excited to be part of the conference, and I very much look forward to the presentation. So let's get started. Eternal sustainability, how some family firms remain entrepreneurial for generations. Very often when we think about family firms, we should actually go a bit back and think about when they were started. And very often we have a founder or a small group of founders who put in a tremendous effort, sweat equity, and their working hands and their minds to create considerable wealth in the business and beyond the business. And that is a starting point. In the family firm, then the question becomes, what will become with that wealth? What will happen with it? So a survey in North America showed that when wealthy people were asked about financial wealth being passed on, the vast majority of them would say there is no such thing as too much wealth being passed on. And as a matter of fact, almost every second wealthy person would say that they want to leave their children as much wealth behind as possible, and that they are confident that the children will act responsibly with the wealth that they will receive. So that means that founders and business owners create considerable wealth and are very confident that the next generation should receive as much as possible and that they will act very responsibly with it. Unfortunately, a look into history will reveal that actually most families historically would make tremendous fortunes, but also lose them usually within less than 100 years. However, there is a few notable exceptions. Two of them are among the richest families in the world, the Rothschild family and the Rockefeller family. They have been around for several generations and are still very wealthy and have shown that it is possible to maintain wealth over longer periods of time. That said, for the majority of families, this is not the case. And the question is why? So first of all, we know that, as I said, that it takes less than 100 years to lose the wealth that was created by previous generations. And that usually happens latest in the third generation. Usually it's the first generation that creates wealth, the second that maintains wealth, and very often the third that squanders or loses wealth. Another reason why that happens is that families on average grow much faster than returns on wealth that people create. So over time, there have been historic studies showing that even if you have a successful business, over decades, generations, and centuries, your family will grow faster than the business. So in every generation, the share that will be passed on to each child will become smaller. And finally, a third reason why tremendous wealth disappears over time is that many catastrophes are unpredictable. Who would have thought 1 year ago that we would enter into a global pandemic and be here? Historically, there have been many examples, from droughts to pandemics, to wars, to changing environmental situations, or to changing laws. One example here is, for example, for mainly European countries, the amount of wars that happened. And from a perspective, you might say that any type of civil unrest or war has a chance of leading to considerable destruction of wealth in the country. And you could see that there are countries historically over the last 500 years that had a tremendous amount of conflicts that led to a major destruction. In interviews with families, some of which I'll refer to in my presentation today, we've had families refer to wars in the 1618 to 1648 30-year war in Europe. We've had families to refer to how they survived wars in France with Napoleon and other wars. So this is just another example of things that can be unpredictable and have a very negative influence. So if it is so difficult to ensure that wealth actually stays there and successfully is passed on, the question is it possible that maybe the business could be the engine, right, that continuously creates wealth for the current and for future generations to come. We see from data, and I don't have specific data on Saudi family business, but we know that for Asia as a whole, the number of family businesses is not only rising, but they're growing in numbers. And they are becoming a very successful multinational, international, and global companies. And the question is, is the business maybe a better instrument than just financial wealth to create future opportunities for generations to come? So the question is, can the family business be a so-called perpetuum mobile? A perpetuum mobile is a device that constantly creates energy or wealth. And it is a construct that many researchers, engineers have for thousands of years all over the world tried to construct. This is a drawing. You can see there, it's a bit like a mill where the water flows and then flows up and then creates. And the idea is that it's something that constantly creates energy forever and therefore can pay dividends that everyone can enjoy. And that is the question for today. Can the family business be that? And the point here is to talk about transgenerational entrepreneurship. So when we look at this topic, there's two problems. The first one is regarding families, because if we think about transgenerational processes, we have to look at families. And unfortunately, we see that in the Western world, roughly 30% of family firms make it to the second generation, and only around 15% to the third generation. So a lot of them don't make it. And the main reason is transition processes from one generation to the other. So that has to do very little with the business in itself. It is a family topic. We know that high quality predecessor-successor relationships, strong motivation by the successor, and a high quality education and experiences of the successor create opportunities in future generations to come. We also know that there are tremendous threats, however, that explain the low survival rates of many family firms in succession. There might be a low ability of the successor, entitlement to particular positions without adequate educational experience. There might be relational conflicts, whether it is with the older generation or with siblings or cousins who might also have large shares in the business. And there might also be larger financial factors. For instance, depending on the jurisdiction one is and how the company is structured, there might be large tax burdens up in inheritance, or the need to make tremendous investments to buy out other shareholders or to rejuvenate the company. But if one can take care of these things, and we know that these things can be taken care if given enough time and the possibility for family to prepare, the question is then, can the family business, if it wasn't for succession, be an engine for transgenerational entrepreneurship and wealth creation? On average, research, mainly Western research, shows that family firms invest less, receive fewer patents, enter fewer markets, and do so more slowly. But it is just an average. A closer look reveals that some of them not only grow faster than other firms, but that they actually prosper for generations. The big question is, why do they succeed? Why do some do better than all the others? And the second related question is, how exactly do they do it? What is that recipe that would allow us to create that engine that might create wealth for generations to come and thus leave a legacy for future generations? This was a question of a research project that focused on very old German companies. The idea here was to learn from companies that are multi-generational, and the average company in this sample was almost 300 years old, and on average in the 11th generation. The oldest company was in the 30th generation and 1,000 years old. So we focused on very old companies in an industry that had to be very old. So it was an agricultural industry, but these were small and medium-sized companies that were 100% owned and managed. And that had to be at least 3 generations old. As mentioned, they're on average 11th generation old, and they had to be approaching succession and being able to deal with succession. We followed these companies for 11 years through the succession processes to learn and to see how the previous generation engaged in entrepreneurship and to see whether the next generation would engage in entrepreneurship. We conducted over 100 interviews and had more than 30 visits of these businesses. And these are just some of these examples. So it is on average, as I said, 11 generation businesses. We have had 21 businesses we followed. And they had on average rather 7.5 employees that were non-family members and up to 30 temporary employees who were used, for example, during harvest. So the important thing to start with is that some of these firms were, although despite their age, tremendously entrepreneurial. Some of these firms were active in up to 60 international markets with their products. Also has to say that also they might be focused on agriculture. They might have had restaurants, stores, hotels. So they might have also been active in related sectors where they could take advantage of the products they were producing. And we realized two things. The most entrepreneurial firms, they are very good at differentiating the products. Whether it was opportunities to grow novel plants, to try something new, or to offer sophisticated products to particular customer groups, they're very good at it. The second thing is they were extremely good at developing lasting relationships with new partners. That was visible that some of them took a lot of time to go to new markets, train their sales personnel, be available and collaborate. And as you can see here in these boxes, these are examples of quotes that we got when interviewing these families. So to give you an example on the relationship building, one older generation family owner told us why we are so successful. I've been to the US 3 times this year. 3 times, 2 weeks long. I know all our distributors. I know all the clients. I also do training with all my distributors, salespeople. That is our strength. If we gave this up tomorrow, we would face a sales collapse within half a year. So these family firms were thriving, and what they needed was just to find a successor and continue. But what about others? Well, the reality is that there was also some non-entrepreneurial firms in the sample. And they were risk averse, they were static, and they were not focused on entrepreneurial opportunities and on growth. They're focused on continuity. We had the feeling that these companies were mainly interested in passing on the business to the next generation, to pass on their responsibility. Although the business wasn't healthy, it was very often hollow. They had very little cash flow. They had few resources left. And there was also maybe the passion wasn't anymore there to do it. And they were complaining a lot about the situation, about all the things that are wrong, but lacked the solutions to maybe turn around the situation. Not surprisingly, it was also these families that had difficulty of finding a successor. And so it was unclear what would happen with it. So now is the question, what really distinguished those that continued to be entrepreneurial, that found a successor and continued to be entrepreneurial with the next generation, from those that had trouble finding a family successor, that lacked entrepreneurship? First and foremost, our finding was that those that were more entrepreneurial had what we call an entrepreneurial legacy. They had stories and narratives that they shared with pride about what previous generations had created, about their entrepreneurial endeavors, but also about how they survived difficult times, how they managed to deal with climate change, droughts, wars, catastrophes, family tragedies, and that these things made them more resilient and more adaptable over time. So an entrepreneurial legacy and a tremendous wealth of stories that give people, the next generation, identification and pride to be associated with the business. It also gives meaning. On a side note, I think it was Rockefeller who said that wealth without values, without meaning, is just money, and money will be spent. So it's a good idea, and we could see very clearly how important it is to have a purpose and to have meaning why you engage in a particular business, and these narratives accomplish that. The second thing that we realized, that all of the families that were successful in finding successors and very entrepreneurial, they had very cohesive and stable families. Again, this is here a good example, where in one family, they realized when we asked them who family is, they started listing people and realized they'd be close to listing 70 to 80 people. And they're all close to each other. When needed, they will help out. They can rely on each other and they are there for each other. We could see that it's not only having these stories of past achievements give you pride and identification and purpose, but it's also important to have a cohesive and functional family where people are happy to be part of and where they are willing also to learn from previous generations rather than seeking maybe the individual path and leaving. So what happened in these families that had these narratives and that had functional and cohesive large families, they were able, a combination, these families were able to motivate the next generation to pursue what we call strategic education. The next generation was involved early on in the business, so they could understand the products, they could get to know business partners. So they could, as some of them said, we grew up in the business. We knew everyone here. We know the technology, we know the products. We are always there. In the following, when they identify with the business, the history, and with the family, they're excited to pursue education and work experiences that align with the needs and future goals of the business. In many cases, we're surprised to see that in agriculture, we have here people who went to the top schools in the world, got their MBAs, started small companies themselves, got work experiences at very, very reputable firms around the globe, only afterwards to return to the family business. They return to the family business to engage in what we call intergenerational collaboration. They work there side to side with the parents' generation. And it was very interesting because the parents actually took care very often of the bureaucratic administrative burdens while creating opportunities for the children who are now adults with tremendous educational and work experiences to carve out and pursue novel opportunities, new markets, new technologies, new products. And it was amazing to see how many new initiatives were started during this period because there was resources for the next generation to get their hands dirty and get things done. And at the same time, mentoring and support by the older generation that has a breadth of experience. And this successful collaboration was tremendously important to lead to what we call entrepreneurial leaps. We could see the amount of innovations and activities in these companies was tremendously high and much higher than in the industry average. It was followed by a last step, what we call strategic succession. And strategic succession is, if you want, the passing on of the baton from the older generation to the next generation. But it wasn't just passing on the key to the premises, it was very different. Two things were important. First of all, strategic succession meant that the older generation had already taken care of all the financial considerations that might impact succession. It was very important here to note that they had, from an early age, the parents were all prepared for the moment when they would actually pass on the business to their own kids, and they had prepared and put money aside to ensure that they could treat their children fairly without dividing the business into too many pieces. In the cases that we see here in this old industry, they always passed on the business as one child and passed on considerable compensation to the other children. I was impressed in one 15th generation family to see that a 21-year-old who hasn't yet succeeded and was just entering the business as a regular employee said, I've started saving accounts for the children that I don't have yet. So one day I can pass on the business to one and pay out all the others. And the one who receives the business is not burdened by debt and by guilt that he might be preferred over others. So one part was to ensure that the business will have breathing room to continue investing. And we've seen that in the non-entrepreneurial businesses where family squabbles over ownership and paying out family members came up, we've seen some businesses that had to incur considerable debt and paid it back only over 25 years, which considerably reduced their ability to invest, for example, in research and development, new market development, and new products. So financial issues in succession have been taken care of. The other part was very interesting too. The other part of strategic succession is to take care of potential partners of the successor. Families have realized over generations how important it is not only to have a cohesive family, but to ensure that the family growth is also structured and cohesive. One owner said, we have learned over 12 generations that every generation brings 50% new blood, and that needs to be handled carefully. And my question was, why? I said, for two reasons. Very often you have potential successors who marry other potential successors, and then you might have no successor because they might have one business in one city and one business in another city. But it can lead to a lot of problems in the relationship when there is expectations from parents on both sides that they actually enter one business, but they are usually unable to take over the businesses of both families. Another reason was that every family communicates differently and might have slightly different values. And so it's important to ensure that new in-laws add resources to the business and to the family and are smoothly integrated rather than cause maybe some tensions, not only necessarily with the spouse, but also with other family members. So we could see that old families put in tremendous effort to moderate even future spouses' involvement and help find ways to communicate and be aware of values to ensure that it would be clear what would be ahead of time. And for many young people, it might not be clear what it means to take over a medium-sized businesses with all the responsibilities and burdens that come with it. And they said it was very important to prepare potential in-laws on the path that successors are likely to take. All of that together in our actual published paper looked like this, and I just want to take it to summarize it. The strategic education that I mentioned allowed the next generation to recognize and pursue novel opportunities in the family business. The collaboration, what we call bridging across generations, allowed companies to have resources to pursue these opportunities and leapfrog ahead of others. And the strategic transition or succession allowed the company to preserve key resources for future investments. And all of that was only possible because the next generation saw purpose in the company, pride in the history, and was happy to stay around and work with the family. And that is a part of what we call entrepreneurial legacy in cohesive families. So what are the takeaways of that? What does that mean? And obviously that is a context of Germany where we studied these companies in a particular industry. But it is very important, and we see it now also elsewhere, to share stories that give meaning and purpose and identification to the next generation. We are at a time where in some international surveys, only 5% of next generation members say they really want to come back, join the family business. Why? Because very often they believe that they want to find their own purpose or meaning, and very often they don't know about all the purpose and meaning that is already there, because they might have grown up in a very protected and very beneficial and luxurious environment, but without the connection to what has created the legacy of their parents or the family. The second thing that has become clear in our study is it is important to maintain the cohesion of the family and to invest in the family. Without a functional family and a cohesive family, the business is unable to prosper across generations. It will not rejuvenate the way it could. And to give you examples, we have had several families that after generations of successful operation got into conflicts, very often among cousins. And these companies were 5, 10, 15 years later at the brink of bankruptcy after tremendous legacies have been created by 10, 15, or 20 generations before. What's next? If you can share stories and have the cohesion of the family, involve the children in the business as early as possible. Show them the products. Show them how they make a difference to customers, clients, to the community. It is important and will give them purpose. It will also help them understand what the family or the parents, grandparents, and so on have created. In the following, it will be much easier to guide children's strategic education and work experience because they'll be excited to do things that might be aligned with the families, rather than passionate about leaving their heritage behind and doing something completely different. Finally, once they are adults and have that education and experience, they need to have the resources to experiment, to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. It's important to make them early on, ideally with other people's money. And here, what we have seen very clearly is that if there's good relationships across generations, the next generation needs some resources. They have a lot of passion usually, and they have a lot of knowledge, and they definitely also benefit from the mentoring of the older generation. Without a cohesive family, this intergenerational bond will be difficult to establish. That mentoring relationship will be challenging. But in many cases that we have seen, it worked out very well. But as I said, functional and good family is the starting point. Finally, the last 2 points. It's important to plan early and openly which resources will be needed to grow the business and to pass it on to the next generation, as there might be financial implications, tax burdens, investment needs, and so on. And a lot of families are surprised about these things. Why? Because they don't plan for the moment that will come eventually. And finally, as I mentioned, integrating potential in-laws in the family and the firm is very important and helpful, and should not be neglected, as every generation brings 50% of new blood, and that blood should hopefully become an asset and a resource for the family rather than a burden. With that said, I believe the important thing to highlight towards the end is that there is no perpetuum mobile. Historians have described that over 1,000 scientists in the last 1,000 something years have spent their life looking for a machine that would eternally create value and energy, and they have all failed because principles of engineering, of gravity, and laws of physics don't create such machines. However, we know that there are family businesses out there that have created mechanisms to govern the family and the businesses in ways that they are able to create for generations and generations to come considerable wealth, meaning and purpose, and to contribute to the communities in which they live. And this study has shown some of the hidden ingredients in this recipe that will hopefully also help families in Saudi and elsewhere to embark on such legacies. That is the end of my presentation. I hope you have enjoyed it. I think this research project was highlighted in a Wall Street Journal article in the year 2015 and was picked up, I think, by 27 other media outlets around the world that have spoken about it. I've also used it regularly to present to family business boards and to help prepare next generation members. And with that being said, I want to thank you for your attention, and I believe we're moving on to the next stage of the presentation.
Yep. Thank you very much, Professor Peter. Amazing learnings and insights, and thanks for this enlightening presentation. We'll touch upon some of the key themes and messages which you have delivered in our panel discussion. But now I will request Mr. محمد بترجي to reflect on the topic of transgenerational entrepreneurship from a deep Saudi perspective. Muhammad will be sharing his perspectives on different types of entrepreneurship that exist in Saudi, as well as shedding some light on how some aspects of entrepreneurial orientation are influenced by some of the local cultural aspects. Over to you, Sayyid Muhammad.
Thank you, Fuad, and thank you, Peter. I'm very pleased to be here today. Actually, in my doctoral study, I have read a lot of papers that was written by Peter, and I am very honored today to be talking in the panel with him. So I think one of the points that Peter has mentioned in his last slide, that families shall give the younger generation or the next generation the opportunity to be entrepreneurial. So it is very important for families to understand what does it mean to be entrepreneurial and what kind of entrepreneurship there are. I think the most obvious one that every one of us know directly and think of it is to start a new company. However, there are other types of entrepreneurship that families can also consider, and they can believe it is an area where they can give the opportunity to the next generation. And also it's an area for the next generation to recognize and realize themselves and their dreams. For example, it can be an addition of a new product or a new service, which is not as risky as starting up a new company. This is something that we have seen a lot of local entrepreneurial families starting it as addition of a new product. In addition to that, it can be also to advance or to improve the business process or the business model. And this is again something we have seen with many of the families moving into online, doing more e-commerce, transferring the business from the old trading houses into being a service provider, providing warehouses, providing delivery service, collection services, as what was going into the industry. Again, another type of entrepreneurship can be accessing of new markets, whether it is about new countries, new cities, or as we have said, just new channels. Finally, which is redefining the products and providing them to new users. And I think if we as families look and consider these different types of entrepreneurship, maybe there will be more opportunities for us to provide for the next generation the opportunity to be entrepreneurial. And it is very important to highlight that maybe Peter has mentioned that it is a small percentage of family members, they are interested to join the family business because they would like to pursue their dreams somewhere else. While I think it is being a part of a family business provides you a great platform to pursue your dreams. There are many studies that they have talked about entrepreneurship in different cultures, in different countries. And I wanted to talk about some of the cultural aspects within our country and how it relates to entrepreneurship, and how can we as families take these points into consideration and consider them for the future. But first of all, I would like to explain something that is a very important construct, which is called the entrepreneurial orientation. So what is entrepreneurship? What is it made of? So many studies have talked about that entrepreneurial orientation is consisted of innovation, proactiveness, and risk-taking. Okay, so entrepreneurial families, those who are able to innovate, those who are able to take risks, and those who are able to be proactive. Today, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the proactiveness and the risk-taking and how they relate to our culture. Now, there have been many studies that have related, that have talked about some of the cultural aspects. For example, if we talk about Hofstede, which talked about uncertainty avoidance, individualism, masculinity, and power distance. So these studies have said that uncertainty avoidance is negatively related with the risk-taking. So families that are highly interested to avoid uncertainty, they don't take risk, and also they are not proactive. And Saudi families in general, they like to avoid uncertainty. So what can we do? Well, one of the ideas that we can suggest here is that how can families ensure that there are some safe income, that there are some safe businesses, which will help people to be certain about the future. This will enable them to be more risk-taking and also more proactive. Moreover, we have also talked about individualism and collectivism, how collective societies are more able to be proactive. In the Saudi society, we are proactive, we support each other. We are collective, we support each other, we work within the families, with other families in the society. So it is very important for us to ensure these traits and these cultural values. We understand now with all of the changes that are happening worldwide, it is very important to emphasize how we should be collective, working together, help us as a family to be proactive and to be entrepreneurial. One of the most important points which has affected negatively also risk-taking and proactiveness was power distance. Power distance is how is the power of the higher generation or higher authority within the family business. So how is the relationship between the father and the son, the uncle and the son, the older brother and the younger brother? And as a Saudi society, we have high power distance. It is not easy to challenge the higher power. And this affects entrepreneurship negatively. So as families, as the current generation, we have to ensure there are the proper channels which will allow for better communication between the existing generation and the upcoming generation in order for us to increase the proactiveness and the risk-taking. I think this is something that we see in our day-to-day. We see with families that have shown to be entrepreneurial, the communication channel is widely open between the previous generation and the coming generation. If I talk about my personal experience, I remember my grandfather, for example, when he decided to retire at 60, and many people, they have criticized him, it's too early, you have been doing a lot, why is that? And he mentioned that, okay, now is the time for my kids, they are in the right moment, they will do better than I do. He kept maybe for 30 years after his retirement visiting us from time to time. And when he comes to the office and I want to talk about business with him and he says, well, you know better than I do. My ideas were suitable for my time. Now it is your time, it is your ideas. So ensuring this open communication has been very effective. And it is something that we need to understand our culture. We need to understand how we can support this kind of communication in order for us to support entrepreneurship. Understanding our culture, the different types of areas where it affects the entrepreneurship, whether positively or negatively, is very important in order for us to take the necessary measure to do what is needed. And if we look around to see the entrepreneurial families within our region that has been able to survive, to continue, to live for a long time, it has been very entrepreneurial in each and every generation. And we can see that open communication between the previous generation and the coming generation has been very critical. We also have seen that they have been important part of the society. They have been working collectively with the society, supporting the society, and emphasizing on the collectivism of our culture. And also they have made sure that there is some safe income, whether through fixed income or whether through not touching the core business. This has allowed family business to take more risk and to be proactive because they know that there is some income that will always be there to support the family. I thank you again for listening to me and for this opportunity, and we look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muhammad, and these are very enriching insights on the peculiarities of entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia with Saudi family businesses. I think we are now gearing up for the panel discussion, where we'll get into more details on some of the themes that both of you have very much emphasized on. So I think I'll start with Professor Peter with our first question on the panel discussion. Professor Peter, you rightly emphasized on the strategic importance of high quality predecessor and successor relationship for successful transitions. How can families develop these relationships, Professor Peter?
That's an excellent question. I think first of all, I want to thank you, Mohammed, for your insights. I had to take some notes because I thought that it was interesting for me to see that some of the things you described have been very similar things that we observed in these families that I presented before. But moving on to your question, you're absolutely right, Fuad, that it is critical to have a high quality relationship. What we see is that very often the relationship in between the current leaders of a family business, the children, is actually weaker than in other families. Why? Because these people work far more and spend on average less time. So a survey in North America has shown that entrepreneurs don't work 40 to 45 hours, but work 110 hours a week.
Oh, wow.
So then, especially when they are starting a business and growing it, not only starting, but especially when you grow it, because it's high growth. So then you can see how much time there is left to spend with the children, possibly, right, or with the family. And what happens then is that, at least in the Western countries that are more individualistic, so we have to be careful here to generalize, that very often entrepreneurs or business owners actually get far more often divorced and have problems with their partners because they are absent. So a survey in the US has shown that 26% of business owners got divorced in the last 5 years. That's a lot. And what happens then is that usually the business is blamed for the relationship problems between partners. And then the next generation is raised with the idea that the business is something bad because it damaged the family. What damaged the family was that, the day is only 30 hours in the week, 10 days. There's only so much time you can have. So the important thing here is to be still able to find some form of balance and to communicate and to share. If you cannot share the purpose of the business, right? If it remains something very abstract for the next generation and they feel the business is taking away the parents or the family rather than strengthening it, right? It will be difficult to have a strong relationship. And that relationship is very important because it is very difficult otherwise to listen to the advice of parents, as some of our business owners have said. Without a good relationship, my kids won't listen to me, but they will want to make all my mistakes again themselves, because it's just important to do them themselves. And I think just to Muhammad's point that he made, we have also seen how important it is to have a good relationship also for the parents' generation to accept that the next generation might do things differently. Of the most entrepreneurial firms, we had several retired incumbent or older generation members who were still around and coming into the office, if you want, and said, my son is destroying everything I created. The processes, the technology, right? Even the products, but I have to let him. It's so important for the business to adapt to the new times. And I realize that I love him, we have a close relationship. And now I also realize that my father let me change everything. I will let my son change everything too. But you will only allow it if you have a good relationship.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's quite a difficult kind of mindset to accept, that what you have built over years, the younger generation will come and revamp some of the, some of the practices which were there in the existing business. But thanks for these insights. If we get into a Saudi perspective, Muhammad, how do you see the successor predecessor relationship? How sensitive is this, and how this can be nourished at an early stage?
Well, I think it is definitely very important, and I think it is a complex question because it is very highly dependent on the relationship between the father, son, daughter. So it has a lot of different aspects. But if we can just focus on a few aspects, we can say that there are business-related points and personal-related points. So business-related points can be summer training in the family business, and actually this is one of the things I have also read in a book chapter written by Dr. Dalal al-Rubayshi, who is a Saudi researcher in the family business area, and has produced some very interesting studies about Saudi, but also discussing some of the points among each other regarding the business, and then let the successor make some decisions along the way, sometimes under guidance, and sometimes even if you see there is a risk. I remember in my last discussion with Peter about another project, I told him about some of the few mistakes that I have made early in my career in the family business. They were costly mistakes. I hope that I have paid them by now. But I think also bringing them after some times into board membership, at least to observe and to understand what are the points, what are the things that they need to focus on. From a bit personal related points, I think they can be very simple as spending time together outside of work. And it is very important to get close to their friends, but also at the same time, bringing them close to your friends. I think last week, Fuad, we had a talk and I told you I was in Taif. Actually, I was with my father, with his friends, and with my friends as well. So I see something like this, bringing people together, having the opportunity to discuss and building the trust. And I think this is something that have helped me personally a lot, and I see a lot of value in that. So thank you.
Thank you, Muhammad and Professor Peter. I'll just build a small question into a follow-on question into this. When ideally this successor predecessor relationship should be focused upon, at what stage is the ideal stage of nourishment of this relationship? Any views?
Is it a question to me or for Mohammed? I'm not sure.
I would ask you, Professor Peter.
So we know that from psychology research that at different stages of the next generation growing up, there's different forms of nourishment. And very clearly, you cannot involve a 2-year-old maybe when you go to a trade fair or go to a business meeting to another country, right?
Absolutely.
But we also have had examples where we have seen very clearly that some of the problems that otherwise emerge later on, they can be addressed very early. For example, we have had families, very large families, where it was clear that one child would become the successor. We asked them, you don't have sibling or cousin rivalry? They said, no. At the age of 2, we were all told who will be the successor later on, unless the person will be incompetent or sick or something. And they said, we thought about that in the sandbox, but later on, never again. It was clear. So I mean, there's different nourishment at different times. I believe at the beginning it is far more about providing a warm home and a stable family relationship, and later on it becomes more and more involving the person and sharing business contacts, sharing more knowledge about the business, maybe later on internships or trips abroad and so on. So it evolves.
Thank you, Professor Peter. Ustaz Muhammad, any specific insights on this? On the ideal timing of
I think Peter has covered it perfectly, but I believe that as soon as the child is able to understand, they can be taken sometimes to the office with their parents just to stay, observe people, understand. Then maybe when they are at an age where they can maybe do summer training, even something very safe and acceptable for children, then they can do that. And this is something I believe is very important. Moreover, I think having a role model is very important. Because just by doing that, but not seeing an actual role model who's taking things seriously, who's being proactive, who's being helpful, also takes a lot of meaning out of it. So I think it has to be as early as possible. And as Peter said, different ages, different approaches. And yeah, so that's it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll move back now to Professor Peter again. You mentioned about entrepreneurial legacy and keeping the old stories alive, which is one important factor in building transgenerational entrepreneurship. This was also mentioned in one of the webinars today by Dr. Ghazi bin Zagar. You know, this is something which we have also seen. Many of the Saudi family businesses have made sure that the old stories are kept alive in their boardrooms as well. But with today's changing demographics and the future-focused interest of new generations, this might become quite a challenge. How did you see, Professor Peter, families successfully do this from your research?
This is a great question. So the reality is that some things change and some things never change. I mean, it's not only these companies, but we've also studied companies elsewhere in the world, and a very successful family that runs the Gallagher Group from New Zealand. They highlight in their stories that they also went bankrupt 100, 150 years ago several times. They had amazing ventures and terrible ventures. And, you know, you learn from both, because the most important thing is not to make mistakes, but to learn from them. And I think this ability to learn and to adapt is critical. Regarding the companies that I just presented, when one of the interviews was conducted, one of the owners said, I just got a call, I lost a client, $500,000. That hurts. But the person said, you know, but I remember my grandfather talking about when they had to, the great-great-great-grandparents had to survive the 30-year-long war, 300 years ago. And there was civil war, there was droughts, there was nothing. It was terrible. He said, what is $500,000 contract? I can work tonight and get a $500,000 contract. So it put things into perspective. And it is good to know that there have been bigger challenges probably in the past that somehow people have managed. So when bad things happen, you are resilient. You are more resilient. And I mean, as many younger generation people, many young people nowadays, the millennials, they've never had bad times. Right? They are surprised. But when you go back and talk to parents, grandparents, hear the stories, there have been a lot of bad times in the past in various parts. And it's good to put things into perspective. If you are young, you haven't seen the world yet.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very well said, Professor Peter. Again, I would like, Muhammad, your Saudi perspective on how Saudi family businesses have kept the old stories alive, and how do they use them effectively to inspire new generations?
Well, I think it is this matter is very important, not only to inspire the future generation, but also to keep inspiring the existing generation, and
Absolutely.
also keep inspiring the non-family members within the family business, and also to build trust with suppliers, clients, multinational partners, etc. So I see that one of the things is to include information about the founders and the family business in the different presentation materials. We use this, for example, in BtRجي Pharma, we show one of the first pharmacies that was started in Saudi in the 40s, the BtRجي National Pharmacy. And we explain the story behind that and how 40 years before that, our great-grandfather, who was an orphan, he had to collect each and every penny to support the education of his children and had to send them in these old days to the US and the UK and Egypt to complete their studies, etc. So it is something that we always repeat to remind ourselves, but also to remind everyone around us. And unless it is there, it is part of your website, it's part of your presentation, it's part of different publications that you do, it would be forgotten. So this is one thing. Another suggestion that also some family firms do is from time to time, there are some special editions, or maybe during specific events, there will be a talk where they share stories of the first generation, their contribution, the challenges they went through, some of their photos, etc. Some of their contribution, not necessarily only to the business, but also outside of the business area. What did they do in the society? What they did this. So, for example, in this aspect, at the moment, we are producing a small book that contains some of the articles that my grandfather, he has written 60 years ago. He has written maybe around, I don't know, 50, 60 articles at that time, just small suggestions for the cities, what we should do, what we should not do. And we see some of these suggestions that they have been implemented today. So I think this is something that for us, that we have it, we will share it with ourselves, with our colleagues, with our brothers, sisters, cousins, and also with the next generation. Another thing that also we see is that having a charitable organization by the name of the family or the founder, which will continue and keep the legacy and ensure that we give back to society. So in a systematic way. And I see that as the time passes, this is happening. We see some prominent families and prominent names that they have taken the leads with that. And I think it is a very important aspect to keep the legacy and to ensure that the family name is there, and make sure that the family members understand that their family name is a responsibility. So they have to make sure that they live up to it. Thank you.
That's a very deep insight on philanthropy. And I think we are seeing now many Saudi business families adopting an institutional approach towards philanthropy. So that's a very rich insight. Thank you, Muhammad. I'll move again to Professor Peter. It's quite fascinating that the sample which you showed us in your presentation looked at 11th generation families, which is still managed to keep the family together. We observe that family cohesion becomes quite a challenge, especially around the 3rd and 4th generation for families, because of the number of family members which are there when it comes to 3rd or when it comes to 4th generation. From your perspective, Professor Peter, and what you have seen at a global level, how can families keep cohesion at later generations?
I mean, we have to realize only if you invest and if you care, can you maintain cohesion and derive cohesion. I also believe that there is still a lot of cohesive families, but maybe we're too focused on the worst and the best in society, because we know that people will share negative news, something dramatic 22 times, but positive things only 5. So I mean, there's a lot of newspapers and media and TV have maybe will have more sales if they focus on the negative in society, giving us maybe a bit of a biased picture that everything is falling apart or everything is bad. The reality is that this is maybe not always the case. I believe there's a lot of families out there that are very focused on investing into cohesion, maintaining cohesion, communicating well, and so on, and have very clear processes of how to manage the family. Because a healthy family will contribute to the business and make it more sustainable and resilient. The dysfunctional family will be unable to do that. So I want to say that maybe it is not as bad as some people believe, but it's maybe a biased picture. And how to do it? I believe we have to realize that every generation has different challenges, right? A founder's generation, which is usually one or a very small group of people, then you have a sibling partnership where, for example, the family members still grow up in the same household. But very often in 3rd, 4th, 5th generation, they are cousins and they grow up in different households, get education in different parts of the world, different experiences. This can very much enrich the family and the business, but it also can bring in different perspectives, values, ways of communicating, different ideas. And the reality is people don't communicate so often anymore with each other. So there is also tremendous potential for conflict. So if you want, in later generations, there's tremendous potential for both enriching experiences, but also a lot of more tension, and that has to be all managed carefully.
Yeah. And I think the diversity of the later generations brings complexity as well. So that's the
case. So not only in numbers, but also in backgrounds and experiences.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Peter. I'll move to Muhammad. what we have seen is that some of the main challenges we have observed is the clash between now generation and next generation when it comes to the business. In many cases, the next generation wants to change and the old generation wants to maintain. From your perspective, how can families create this intergenerational collaboration and make space, meaningful space for next generation entrepreneurial ideas?
Well, I think this is a very important question, and I think it is a two-way responsibility. So there is a responsibility on the existing generation, and there is a responsibility on the new generation. However, let me focus a little bit on the existing generation, since it is the generation that has a lot of influence. I think that the majority of the next generation require training, discipline, and to start at the bottom of the ladder. So it is very important when a family member joins the family that it is very clear their tasks, their mentor, their job, and there must be discipline. So it is understood that they will go through fast track or be promoted faster than the others, but this cannot be done immediately. Okay, so it is very important that they get prepared. This will help the existing generation build trust and will help the new generation build competence and knowledge. Okay, another point is it is important for the existing generation to give some space. They shall not give it easily, but they shall challenge and make them earn it. But in the end, they shall deep inside them decide, okay, we will give them the space, we will challenge the idea, but we will give them the space. Again, it is very important also to take some ways, at least initially, to reduce the risk. So for example, to allow these ideas to be implemented in non-core business or other less important subsidiaries, apply these ideas in totally new business, which will not overwhelm the existing business and its cash flow. Maybe also apply these ideas on specific departments or products or markets, which will not affect the overall situation of the family business. Again, the existing generation shall share with the new generation their view of any initiative and also any points of concern, and then they shall give the new generation the space to make these decisions. Also, the current generation must be aware of the decisions that might not be correct, and they must be willing to take the consequences. So they have to know that, okay, maybe the new generation will not always make the right choice, but we understand what are the consequences and we are willing to take them. And in many cases, the consequences are not fatal. So it is very important to allow them to try, because again, many times the existing generation doesn't know the right answer. There are two options. Okay, maybe they are more inclined to one or the other. So for example, with my younger cousins that I work with, I always tell them, if it was for me, I would do this, but you can decide which option to choose, because both options or all the options that you have shared seems objective, seems fine. I would go with this one because of 1, 2, 3, but it is up to you which one you would choose. Sometimes they would go with what I have recommended, and sometimes they would go otherwise. And if they go otherwise, I would never go and say, oh, I told you so, you should have done it. No. Okay, you have made the decision. It was not maybe the best decision. Let's understand what happened, etc. But again, all of these decisions, they are not fatal decisions, at least in the beginning of the career of these people.
Do you see, just building on what you have said, Muhammad, do you see some of the family businesses in Saudi being open on sharing some of the key mistakes which have been done in their, the past, few decades? Are they open in sharing those learnings and sharing them on a platform with all their workforce? Is this something which you're seeing, Muhammad?
I think they are, and I think the more mature these businesses and these families are, they will be more willing to share these mistakes, especially when they are successful. So when someone is successful, it is very easy to share the mistakes, rather than when someone is not successful, it is a little bit can be shameful. However, it is very important for the listener or for the receptive to understand what applies to them and what doesn't apply.
Yeah.
And also to understand that this mistake or this decision was not right at this time, could be correct at that time. So sometimes families, they say, no, we have tried this, we have done it and it didn't work, and we don't want to do it again. But we have to ask ourselves, why was it a failure? Why it didn't work? Maybe the time was wrong. Maybe the people who were involved were wrong. Maybe there are small details that had made it wrong. So there are some things that we have done and they were not correct when we have done it. But then when we tried to do it again and we understood why what we have done was not successful, we were able to succeed in it. So I think it is very important for the recipient to understand the details of the things.
Absolutely. And I've seen some family businesses actually making a proper record of such kind of learnings and sharing them with the next generation, because these are the treasures which they would like to pass on from one generation to another generation. So these learnings should be I think we encourage all Saudi family businesses to share those learnings with the next generation, because those learnings are important part of the next generation taking charge of the business. I'll request also the audience to please keep on posting their questions on the chat box. I'll ask one last question to Professor Peter. You mentioned next generation education, and you called it strategic education as a very important dimension. But in many cases, what we have seen is that the business might require education in fields or skill sets that do not align with the interest of the next generation. How can families have strategic education given diverging interest from the next generation?
I think it's a great question, and it's a complicated question. I believe that first and foremost, education is not one episode, but it is lifelong learning. And so it doesn't happen over a few years. And we see that even if you start somewhere where there might be little alignment with what the family does, over time there can be more alignment, whether it is in later studies, in a master study. And that also, there's various reasons for that, and that's normal. We also see that it doesn't only have to be university, for example, education, but there's also very valuable practical experiences. And I mean, as I've met very large global businesses that had next generation members who did something completely different, and then started working for a competitor and helped them to not get into bankruptcy, right? I mean, and so the paths are never from point A to B in a straight line. They vary, and it's so important to maintain that level of communication and passion and purpose as people, when they find out who they are as young adults, very often realize after a time of wanting some more distance from home that it might make sense to have more proximity again with home. And I think the other important point here is that it is also important to realize that the family can actually nurture such experiences early on. When you already established through internships, job opportunities, and dealings, maybe a passion or an interest in an industry, it will be later on much easier to also convince that person to gain experiences in the same industry. So it means you don't start at the age of 20, you start actually at the age of 5 maybe, or 6, right? By setting the foundation for that.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor Peter. I will now move into the Q&A, which is the last section in our webinar today. And I'll start with the question which was posted by the audience. And this is addressed to both of you, Professor Peter and Muhammad, both of you. It says that you spoke about leadership succession and entrepreneurship. How do they relate to one another? is transgenerational entrepreneurship dependent on successful leadership succession? And there is another dimension to this question, which is, would there be implications for having a non-family leader on the model which you have presented? So maybe Professor Peter, you could take this, and I'll then move to Muhammad as well.
So 1 second, I was just taking care of some technical issues. I would briefly ask you to summarize the question again, as I was changing the screen, and I just want to ensure that I'll respond fully to it.
Yes, no worries. So no worries at all, Professor. It says that you spoke about leadership succession and entrepreneurship. How do they relate to one another? Is transgenerational entrepreneurship dependent on successful leadership succession?
Yes, so successful leadership succession in these small and medium-sized companies is necessary, but not sufficient. So we can have successful successions where the family is happy, but 10 or 15 years later, the business, there isn't much left of it. We can see that on average, a business model that is created can be profitable and successful for 25 years. So a new idea, a new product, a new service, from initial growth to high growth, smaller growth, maturity and decline, it takes 25 years. Interestingly, the average tenure of the founder also is 25 years in the Western world. So it means that people who come up with great ideas usually leave, maybe they start with the sunrise and they leave with sunset, not realizing that they're not only bringing on a new generation, but that next generation better also have skills to, as Mohammed previously said, to refine, adapt, also maybe challenge and expand, because there is no single idea that for eternity will be a competitive or a single product. And so the entrepreneurial part is critical to complement just regular business or leadership skills.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have another question, which is for Muhammad. It says that, is there a way to institutionalize, to bring an institutional approach towards entrepreneurship in the family?
Well, I think this is the million-dollar question. I think it is very important to look into different aspects. Peter, in his presentation, has talked about the common areas or the common matters which ensure that these families are entrepreneurial. So I think looking at these points is very important. So I can also suggest that companies and families, they have to consider different aspects. For example, one of this is the human resources. So it is very important for families to have long-term investment in people, family and non-family. So if we want to institutionalize entrepreneurship, we have to think in long-term rather than short-term, even with people. Again, cohesive corporate culture is very important. So how we can create the corporate culture that bring everyone together, and how we can always renew this corporate culture. And also, as we said, mentorship is very important. So we have to make sure that mentorship is institutionalized. Who will be the mentor of those who will come? Again, on the social aspect also, we have to look and consider the social aspect. So we have to make sure that we have long-term relationship and network established with suppliers, distributors, all other stakeholders. So this has to also be part of our structure, part of our DNA. Again, when it comes to finance, we must have cautious financial management, as they say sometimes, to build a war chest, to fund innovation, to fund entrepreneurship, but also to ensure the continuity of the family business. Again, it is very important to have a patient capital and long-term innovation. And this happens also by teaching the generation about financial education, to understand that to live a good life, you don't need to be extravagant, but so it is very important to have a patient capital, to think of the future. Absolutely. What has the previous generation have provided you and what you will provide to the next generation. Finally, as we have also talked about many times, is the governance. So focus on innovation, focus on supporting innovative ideas. I think it is very important to look at it from different aspects and again to revisit it from time to time. Again, each and every family has to understand what are their strengths, where they excel, and build on that. So look at the different aspects that we have mentioned, and also Dr. Peter has mentioned in his presentation, and visit each one of them and try to ensure that they are part of the structure, but also create the system for you to revisit them and check them from time to time. Thank you.
Absolutely. What we have also seen that recently, quite a few of the Saudi family businesses are supporting startups and small businesses and supporting accelerators. Do you think, Muhammad, that this is something which will also enhance the spirit of entrepreneurship in Saudi family businesses?
Well, I think it is one area or one approach where they see, okay, it is a way for us to continue being entrepreneurial by outsourcing the entrepreneurship. And this is something we see in large corporations in different parts of the world where they go and invest or acquire different companies in the field. However, I think this is not a replacement for the family themselves being entrepreneurial.
I see.
Basing all of your effort on investing in other areas and forgetting what you need to do to continue being entrepreneurial, I don't think is enough. By this, maybe you will maintain wealth, but maintaining the company and maintaining the business is something else, which Peter has also highlighted it. So maintaining wealth is one thing, maintaining the family business and maintaining this machine that continue to innovate and continue to employ and continue to affect positively the society is a different matter.
Absolutely. I see a strong nod from Professor Peter as well on your statement.
Well,
Professor
it is
I think you fully agree on what Muhammad has mentioned.
Yeah, it's amazing how complementary we are. I believe we talk about the need to find balance between exploitation of opportunities and exploration of new opportunities. And to give you a good example, we can in 3 hours let students, for example, start an online store very quickly. And for many, it is an experience, right, where they have tremendous ideas what to do, but just the experience of being an entrepreneur for a few weeks or months, right, changes their life, because very often there is something that holds them back. And I think it's sometimes opening the eyes to people that it's not only about exploiting, the wealth they already have, but it's finding ways to explore new opportunities and getting also a lot of satisfaction from being able to make a difference to other people's lives.
Yeah. One last question, which I would love that both of you address. It says that as you have studied the impact of crisis, such as wars, pandemics, natural disasters on family businesses, and you mentioned this in your presentation, how do you think COVID-19 is impacting entrepreneurship in family businesses today? So, Professor Peter, maybe you can give us a kind of an international view of this, and then I will ask Muhammad to also give us a deep Saudi view of how the pandemic has affected entrepreneurship in family businesses in Saudi.
It's a great question, which I've heard now twice in the last 3 days, once by national TV and once by an international organization.
Oh, okay.
The reality is that we see that we're now in some industries, for example, through lockdowns, inability to travel, right? Think about gastronomy, tourism, and so on. There is no money to be made. There's only losses right now. And many of these owners, especially of smaller businesses, right, think about shutting down and closing. So the question is, beyond the financials, what is in there? And those that want to pass on something to the kids who have children who are interested and motivated and committed, it's more likely that they will hang in longer, that they'll try longer, that they show more resilience because there's a deeper meaning. They know it's about surviving the crisis and there is light at the end of the tunnel. So that assumes there is a next generation, it's a functional family, right? And that possibly they already have stories of past events that were very destructive, right? Which helps them to get it. It also means there might be a family that might have saved resources, right? To help out. We've seen tremendous examples where families have provided resources to the business in bad times, whereas in good times, they might take a dividend for the risks they are having with ownership. On the other hand, there are families that are not very cohesive, that are not very functional, and that see the business as an entitlement, that fight over how many dividends they can get. And then other than that, they don't see each other. These families are more likely to shut down and liquidate the businesses faster because in a way, there is little that family can add. It is only withdrawn and thereby actually made the business even more vulnerable to any crisis.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Peter. Muhammad, your views?
Well, I would like to talk about the subject or the question in 2 points. The first point is, again, confirming or emphasizing what Peter has said. Family businesses have shown resilience in this crisis, but also in different crises throughout the years for a number of reasons. One is passing it through the next generation. Also is because there are a high commitment, not only to the business, but also to the employees within the business, that family businesses feel that, okay, these are our family, what we will do. They have also families to take care of, etc. But also to ensure that one of the most valuable things that the family businesses have are their brands. So if by the crisis and they will hit out, so people will lose somehow the faith, even if it was not for the main business, for a side business, etc. So again, as Peter said, these family businesses have tried to manage the situation, to come out of it. Families themselves, from their personal wealth, have supported the business to pass through the crisis. But also the pandemic, as you have said, has pushed the family businesses into areas where they were not something to be considered before. For example, I would say that many of the family businesses, especially on the more traditional side, they have not explored the idea of working from distance. And this has, through the pandemic, this is something that they had to do. And it has opened for them a lot of new opportunities. Maybe within family businesses, we did not used to have much, even from the online meetings and all of these kind of discussions. But this has also helped us to maybe get in touch and communicate more faster with all of our stakeholders throughout the world. In addition to that, the higher focus on the digital arena and the digital marketing, especially when we look at the family businesses from a more traditional point of view. This has pushed them to innovate in that area. And I have personally seen a lot of success within some of our family businesses and also within the other family businesses when they saw that, okay, they have to be online, otherwise they cannot survive. They went online and they have seen great success there. They have started to communicate directly with the consumer instead of before they used to communicate with the wholesaler or with the retailer. Their margins have improved, the cash has improved. So many things throughout the pandemic, we had to innovate to ensure that we are surviving well. And it has created and it has introduced us to things that we didn't know that we could do well. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think the pandemic has helped many family businesses to embrace digital transformation and to undertake journeys which they would have taken maybe 10, 15 years. but they have taken those journeys in 1 year. So I absolutely agree. I think we have come to the end of our time slot. I would again like to sincerely thank Professor Peter Jaskevich and Mr. محمد بترجي for being our distinguished speakers, sharing some amazing wealth of information and their learnings. I think there are some important key takeaways and key ideas which I think family business leaders would embrace from this session. I would like to again thank both of you. Really appreciate your valuable time. I would also like to thank the National Center for Family Business for hosting us and for organizing such an enriching conference. KPMG is honored to have been part of this national conference, and we very much look forward to continue partnering with the National Center for future events. Finally, special note of thanks to all our attendees. We do sincerely hope that you found this session a fruitful investment, and we very much look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thank you once again, Professor Peter. Thank you, Mr. Muhammad. Thank you all, and stay safe, stay blessed.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. في حفظ الله.